Morning, everyone, and good morning, Bruce. Thanks for joining us. You came to your job, excuse me, at the Energy Department last year with what you were just telling me is an unusual background. You actually have a degree in electrical engineering, and you've spent decades in the power industry, and you're the first in your position to have that.
That's true. I spent nearly 20 years in Con Edison of New York City on the operations side, running control centers. I was director of emergency management for New York City and the boroughs that we had within Con Ed. And then I went to National Grid, where I was responsible for the entire United States holdings for National Grid from the asset management side, as well as the reliability piece. So I've been doing electrical engineering for almost 30 years.
Well, so you're uniquely positioned to answer my next question, and that is, how reliable is the U.S. electric grid? What grade would you give it?
From a reliability perspective, and and there's been great debates in the industry. So from a reliability perspective, the grid is actually 99.9999% reliable.
Okay.
The issue is not reliability that we're focused on; it's the resiliency of the grid. So over the
What's the difference?
and that's where we're going to go. That's a great question. So the resiliency of the grid is the question that really is what's challenging us today, and that really has to do with the fact that over the last 2 decades after deregulation, the grid has changed from a very fuel-secure generation base to a portfolio that has significant reliance on other infrastructure, energy infrastructure. And I'll give you the exact piece that kind of plagues me a little bit. So,
what keeps you up?
Yeah, what keeps me up there? Well, there's a lot of things that keep me up there. This is one of them. So 20 years ago, 6% of our generation on the electric side was gained from the gas pipelines. Today it's 35%, which means that if I actually lose a pipeline, I actually lose 35, or if I lost all my pipelines, I'd lose 35% of my generation capacity in the United States. And so we're working very hard with our regional transmission operators to understand areas like PJM, right? So if I lost PJM, if I lose pipelines in that area.
Now the whole audience may not know what PJM is.
So Pennsylvania, Jersey, Maryland, regional transmission operator. There's pipelines that go in and feed significant generation in that area. If we lose that pipeline, then we would lose several generators in that regional area. So we're trying to figure out how to protect the pipelines as well as we protect the transmission system. Basically what it boils down to is there's an interdependency today that did not exist 20 years ago. And that interdependency now has created more critical infrastructure in the United States that we have to protect from things like cyber and physical attack.
You said our grid is 99.9% reliable, so then do you give it an A? Do we get
reliability, yes.
Okay, all right. But how do you explain what the American Society of Civil Engineers warned in their recent report when they looked at the grid in the lower 48 and they said it's at full capacity with many lines operating well beyond their design? And this was its 2017 report card, and it concluded congestion raises concerns with distribution, reliability, cost of service. Often a single line cannot be taken out of service to perform maintenance as it will overload other interconnected lines. So is that on target?
Well, I would disagree, and that's why they're civil engineers, not electrical engineers. So
you're saying they don't know what they're talking about?
That's exactly what I'm saying. So, the transmission system throughout the United States is fundamentally built to a second contingency design, which means you can take out any 2 pieces of equipment, transmission lines or generators, and run the system at full capacity. So I'm not really sure where they got their data from, but that's how generally the United States transmission system is built. I would be more concerned about, like I mentioned earlier, about the interdependency. So if I took out a gas pipeline for whatever reason, that has deleterious effects on the transmission system, mainly because of the generation in the United States. So if they've talked about that, that would be great. But I can take out virtually any line in the United States at any time and be able to run the system at full capacity.
But what about the issue that they raise about demand? I mean, as the demands from technology increase, how are we going to meet that?
You know, each company throughout the United States goes through a planning criteria, right? And so they go through what they call an N-2 study, a second contingency study. And so when they plan their transmission system with their generation, And it's gotten a little bit more complicated now that most utilities, or a significant number of utilities in the United States, are not vertically integrated, meaning they don't own generation, transmission, and distribution. So you've got a number, particularly in the East Coast, of companies that just own the transmission and distribution, and then you've got private companies that own the generation. Fundamentally, the utilities that have what we call the T&D, the transmission distribution, go through an analysis every year where they actually iterate through taking out two pieces of equipment, that N-2, right? So they'll take out one piece of equipment and then take out every other major component on the system and see where there's bottlenecks in the system, where things might be overloaded, things of that nature. Where that shows up, where there's a problem, they actually put capital into their system and actually fix the problem. So each of the companies throughout the United States do that, and then above them, you've also got the regional transmission operators that work with FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, to actually ensure that they've got capacity to be able to do that as well. So, the process works very well, and, there's a lot of companies that are out there, everything from the independently owned utilities like Pepco, who serves us today in Washington, D.C., down to municipal and cooperatives as well. And then the Department of Energy actually has 3 power marketing administration utilities that cover about 2 million square miles, where we actually take our federal hydro system that's owned by the Bureau of Reclamations or the Army Corps, and then transmit them over our transmission lines cover about 31 states.
When you started your position last year, the first place you went was Puerto Rico. Can you give us sort of a rundown on how things are going there now? I mean, it took more than 11 months for everyone to get their lights back on. How are they doing now?
They're continuing to work through, developing a recovery plan, and we're working very closely with them through the Office of Electricity. To that end, I mean, we've built a model for them. So we've taken the island, we've modeled the island like a traditional utility would. We're in the process right now of transitioning that model to a real-time model. We're bringing phase measurement units, devices to sense the electric phenomena in the system, and we're installing them in there. In fact, we just shipped them down last week. With that, we've also then gone through and done the analysis on their system with regard to what type of generation they can put on the system to stabilize the grid. Unfortunately, they've got a few plants that are offline that are basically timed out that need to be replaced.
So I understand their grid is a bit too overly centralized, such that when there's a problem, it tends to cascade. I wondered if you're looking at microgrids there?
We've looked at that, but that's actually not the reason that they've had blackouts on the island. So the reason they've had blackouts on the island, and we've solved this problem for them, we've worked through it with them, is the way the grid was designed in Puerto Rico was actually appropriate for where the load existed at the time it was built. Due to maintenance and capital restrictions, they haven't put money into the system and then have lost the generation basically in the San Juan area. So in the northeast area where San Juan is where about 70% of the load is. Unfortunately, today, the generation capacity on the island is in the southern part of the island. And so what ends up happening is you have to rely on 50 miles of transmission lines to get to the load up in San Juan. So
that's often where problems are, right? Transmission lines.
Well, the transmission lines are a problem in that generally if you were designing a system, you put your generation where your load is. It's kind of like electrical engineering 101. So when you have 70% of your load in San Juan, normally you would have 70% of your generation in San Juan. The generation plants at Palo Seco and San Juan, which are the two areas where they did have generation, Palo Seco is actually offline, has been offline well before Hurricane Maria due to some structural steel issues. So they don't have enough generation. They have about 400 megawatts of generation in San Juan when they need about 2,000 megawatts. So you have to rely on the transmission system to take it from the south to the north. Unfortunately, basic physics get involved, and you start having things, line losses, reactive power flow problems. That was actually the problem that we had during the recovery, so the restoration. So I was down there about 2 weeks after the hurricane hit, helping them restore the system and actually, power the transmission system to get the rest picked up. The problem we fundamentally had was we had the generation in the south, which basically was intact, had no problems, and we had a transmission line that had very little problems on the west side of the island. we were able to fix those quick. But the problem is when you start transmitting, power across long distances, you have these line losses and you have a magnetizing problem. So we actually, the Army Corps was there, and very fortunately, and I've been in this business for a long time, I've never seen an organization move out as quickly as the Army Corps did. We put two 25-megawatt generators in Palo Seco, and the joke was we didn't light a light bulb with it, but what we did do was we magnetized the entire transmission system. So once we were able to put that generation there, we could magnetize, the whole transmission system and actually start restoring it. So we're continuing to work with them. We've put together a phase 1 approach on what we believe are the best investments. I believe, based on the analysis we've done, that generation in that Palo Seco area is going to really stabilize the island. One, it eliminates the whole reactive power flow issue. Number two, it eliminates the line losses on the island. And number three, and probably most importantly, it drives the cost of the commodity down about 40% for the entire island, which is a huge economic driver and something we're really hell-bent on doing.
So I want to jump to the National Climate Assessment because it does sort of have to do with Puerto Rico in that it predicts more severe storms like Maria, so more threat to our grid from storm surge on the coast, from higher temperatures throughout the year, issues with hydroelectric power from decreasing water flow in our rivers. What are your thoughts on the threats that are outlined?
We take an all-hazards approach within the Office of Electricity, so we look at every hazard that's out there, and we incorporate that into our planning with regard to the design of the grid. We're very, very fortunate in that so we have two organizations in the energy sector that coordinate with the federal government. One is the Electricity Sector Coordinating Council, and the other is Oil and Natural Gas Coordinating Council. And that membership, the membership of those organizations is made up of, for like the electricity sector, 30 CEOs and the trade organizations for the entire industry, APPA, NRECA, EEI. And so we work very closely with those folks to really ensure that we can, basically take the best practices and make sure everybody's aware of them, and then we can utilize them in the system. So as we look at resiliency, the all-hazards approach, we take a look at cyber, physical risk, the weather events that we've got, the fires in California. And we work with the underlying utilities and more broadly the industry to solve those problems through the capabilities we have at our 17 national labs within DOE.
All right, before we go to questions, I want to quickly ask you about cyber. Obviously, when we heard from DNI, Dan Coates, he said the threats from cyber attacks are increasing in frequency and sophistication. DHS says more than half are aimed at the energy sector. What are we doing to protect it?
Well, that's a great question. So obviously this is a focus of the President as well as the Secretary of Energy, Rick Perry. And Rick Perry, his leadership, we stood up an entire office focused on cybersecurity. So we stood up the organization called CSER. Used to be in my organization. We split it out because of the importance and elevated it. Karen Evans is the Assistant Secretary for that. And so we have now a complete focus at the Assistant Secretary level for cybersecurity, energy security, and emergency response. So we take this threat very seriously. That and physical threat are the two threat vectors that we are the most focused on. And we'll continue to work with our partners within industry, as well as the intelligence community, which DOE is part of, because we have the National Nuclear Security Administration, NNSA, within DOE. So we have very good visibility on what the threat vector is, and through that office of CSER, we are very much focused and working with industry to solve the problem. Not only the electric side, but the oil and natural gas side, because again, as I mentioned earlier, there's tremendous interdependence that today is inextricably intertwined.
Okay, all right, let's go to questions. Do we have any? Here we have, identify yourself, please.
Yeah, John Whitworth with pedestrians.org. What is the impact of renewables on the system, both utility scale and rooftop?
Yeah, so renewables have really made some tremendous progress in being integrated into the grid, both at a megawatt scale and behind the meter.
I was going to say, let's put up a graphic while you talk that shows actually the breakdown of our power system and how much is renewables. There you go. Go right ahead.
Oh, okay. So, we believe, and I believe in our department, we are looking for renewables to really, from a strategic standpoint, provide really a great opportunity from a national security perspective to provide power where, things like fossil or nuclear or something else may not be available, or where there's interdependencies based on the supply chain. So,
does that need to increase, that 17%?
Absolutely. I think at the end of the day, and I think the Secretary said this many times, we look at this from an all-of-the-above approach, right? Any generation, and I've said this many times, any generation is a good generation. And really, what we're concerned about from a national security perspective is really looking at how do I secure the fuel supply or the supply chain that really provides the, whatever it's going to be to then end up in the generation component. So, as I mentioned earlier, when I've got a gas pipeline that runs for hundreds of miles to feed a gas generating unit, the problem is if you take out the pipeline, I lost my gas generation unit. If I have a solar or wind farm there, that's great, because that doesn't need to have the supply chain component. Where we do struggle, and I was at a meeting in South Carolina, South Carolina, about 2 weeks ago, is the IEEE standard 1547, which really gets into how do you integrate.
What is that in layman's terms?
Those are the integration of renewable standards. Okay. So where we're struggling a little bit is the protection on the system as we integrate things like solar. So the traditional relaying that was set up was really is 100-year-old technology. As we start converting things through power electronics from DC to AC, some of the fault currents that we see particularly on the distribution system, are very different than what we've seen in the past. So I've been meeting with a number of companies. Duke was at that meeting and talked with a number of folks from there, where they're struggling to actually get the protection schemes to work properly on the distribution system. So it's something that we're working on within our labs to really come up with the next next generation of all the protection schemes that will actually be able to integrate more and more of the renewables. Because they really have a lot of space to take over as we, expand the system in the portfolio.
All right, and we only have 27 seconds. Anyone with a really quick question?
It's like a yes, no question.
Richard Lehman, Rebuilding Place. You mentioned threat vectors. My understanding is a lot of the wildfires in California are triggered by uninsulated power lines, arcing and stuff. How is the department dealing with that a priority?
Right. I know we have residents of Paradise suing PG&E right now.
Yeah, no, that's true. So Geisha Williams and I have known each other a long time. Pat Hogan, who actually runs our system, was my boss when I was at National Grid. So we've talked with PG&E, and from the perspective of uninsulated power lines, every power line in the United States is uninsulated. So it's not unique to California. That's just the way the system is, right? So our transmission system it's bare aluminum with steel, insert. So our distribution system you might have a covering on it, but it's still, it's fundamentally uninsulated. We are working with them through some of the technology that we have that actually has a higher capability to do sensing. So today, the best sensing technology on the market senses about 50 times a second. We've been pushing, and I was just actually down at Oak Ridge National Lab, which is where we have some of this technology running right now. We're actually pushing this capability up to about 1 million times a second. And that fidelity will allow us to actually see electric phenomenon. So if something sparks on your system, we'll actually be able to see the spark because of the change in the physics on the system. So we're working with them. Obviously, they're in emergency restoration mode at the moment, but we've got plans actually to put these in their system. Unfortunately, they're not commercially available. They're really not ready for commercialization. But given the risk that's associated with the wildfires, we're actually going to work to get it into their system and really just prove out the capability to identify those systemic risks.
Excellent. Thank you for your terrific questions, and please thank my wonderful guest, Bruce
Thank you.
Walker, Assistant
Appreciate it.
Secretary of Energy.